the toy that moved on its own. In 2016, the Peterson family thought they had found their dream home in southern Ohio. The old house, with its spacious rooms and sunlit windows, seemed perfect for raising their children, Jake and Emily. With a large backyard and an expansive basement that captivated the kids, it had everything they needed to start a new chapter in life. Although the basement was slightly damp and dark, typical of older homes, the children loved it immediately and soon made it their new playground. For the first few months, the house was a paradise. Jake and Emily spent entire afternoons playing in the basement, laughing and exploring every corner. But soon, strange things began happening. The first time, Jake went down to the basement before bed and found one of his remote control cars whirring in circles on the floor, as if it were being operated by an unseen hand. Intrigued and a little scared, he called Emily, who was equally fascinated but brushed it off, thinking it was a battery issue. They turned the toy off and went upstairs for dinner, trying to ignore the incident. But the occurrences continued. Night after night, the toys seemed to come to life. Faint sounds of small motors buzzing echoed through the quiet house, as if the toys had turned on by themselves. When the parents went down to check, they found the basement disheveled, with toys scattered in different places than where they'd been left. The remote control car, in particular, kept appearing in various spots in the basement, even though it was supposedly switched off. One evening, Mr. Peterson heard faint children's laughter coming from the basement while the family was watching a movie. Thinking the kids had gone downstairs, he went to check. He found the space empty, toys out of place, but Jake and Emily were both upstairs, fast asleep. Perplexed, he told his wife about it, and they decided to chalk it up to the quirks of an old house. Things took a stranger turn when Emily casually mentioned her invisible friend at breakfast. "He likes to play downstairs," she said with a smile. The parents exchanged confused glances and asked who this friend was. "He doesn't say his name, but he loves our toys," she replied, shrugging. While it's not unusual for children to have imaginary friends, her comment left them uneasy. That night, when they asked Jake about the friend, he confirmed, saying the mysterious friend only appeared in the basement and sometimes moved the toys around. The incidents escalated. One particularly quiet night, Mr. Peterson heard a low, repetitive sound coming from the basement. As he went down to investigate, the basement lights suddenly went out. In the darkness, he could hear the distinct sound of toys shifting, and he sensed an unseen presence beside him. When he managed to turn the light back on, he found all the toys stacked in one corner, with the remote control car perched on top, its wheels spinning slowly, despite being turned off. Shaken and desperate for answers, the Petersons tracked down the house's previous owner. He shared a disturbing story. Decades ago, a child from the family had tragically passed away in the basement. Since then, toys had moved on their own, and laughter had occasionally been heard. "It's like he never left," the former owner said, his expression grave. "This house has a life of its own." Determined to leave, the Petersons began packing up their belongings. On the night before their departure, as they boxed things up, they heard one final, clear laugh echo from the basement, lingering long enough to make them freeze. When they reached the door to leave, they noticed the remote control car perched at the top of the basement stairs, eerily still but emanating a menacing aura. The family left the house that same night, carrying with them the memories of laughter, toys that seemed alive, and the haunted look of the former owner, as if he knew the house could never truly be left behind. The Hidden Room. In 2018, I bought my first house, an old 1920s building in Chicago, and immediately began the renovations I'd always dreamed of. As an architect, the process of restoring this house was a delight. The charm and history of the structure seemed like the perfect opportunity to revive a beauty forgotten by time. I spent weeks exploring every corner and planning each room's details. But during one of these explorations, something odd caught my attention in the basement, a brick wall that didn't quite match the rest of the structure. The bricks were a lighter color, as if they'd been laid long after the original construction. I was intrigued and increasingly convinced that wall was hiding something. I invited a friend who was a mason to help investigate. As we started tapping on the bricks, we realized there was an empty space behind them. After a few hours of removing part of the wall, we revealed a small windowless room, like an improvised prison. In the center of the space was a dusty bed and an old rocking chair positioned in a disturbingly deliberate way. Scattered across the floor were old newspapers dating back to the 1930s, creating a heavy, claustrophobic atmosphere. Then I noticed a black and white portrait on the wall. It was of a woman, her expression tragic and weary, staring intently, with an almost invisible shadow in the background that seemed to be watching me as well. The sight sent a shiver down my spine, filling me with an unease I couldn't shake. After uncovering the room, the house no longer felt as peaceful. At first, I heard faint creaking in the floorboards at night, but always at the same time 3 in the morning. What started as small noises soon escalated to the sound of the rocking chair moving on its own. Every night, the sounds grew more intense, and the figure in the portrait seemed to come alive within the house. One night, I woke up with the distinct feeling of being watched. I looked toward my bedroom door just in time to see a shadow moving slowly, heading toward the basement. Heart racing, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way downstairs. There, as I shone the light into the hidden room, I saw the rocking chair moving gently on its own, as if something were sitting in it watching. The next day, shaken, I went to the local library to research the house's history. I discovered that the residence once belonged to a woman named Margaret, who, after the tragic loss of her husband and son, became a recluse. Driven mad by grief, Margaret believed her son was still with her and spent increasing amounts of time locked in the basement, where, years later, she was found dead in that same rocking chair. The discovery left me even more unsettled. It felt as if Margaret's presence had become part of the house, as though she were still there, waiting for something or someone. One night, as I tried to sleep, I heard a whisper coming from the basement. "He's here with me?" The sad, desperate tone of the voice froze me with fear. It was then I realized I couldn't stay there any longer. I decided to sell the house. During the process, I sensed Margaret's disapproval, as if the house, with its hidden room and lingering sorrow, was a place she never wanted to leave. I left the house with the secret room untouched, not looking back, knowing this story wasn't mine to hold. Since then, I've heard that no one stays in the house for long. Footsteps and whispers are still reported, and the gentle creak of the rocking chair continues to echo through the night. Perhaps Margaret remains, still waiting for the son who never returned. The strange trail of dust. In 2014, my wife, Samantha, and I finally found the home we'd been searching for. After months of hunting, we discovered an old property on the outskirts of Detroit. Built in the 1920s, the house had a charming style and a spacious yard. It was everything we wanted, as if it had been waiting for us. The previous owners were eager to sell, offering it at a price below market value. Without hesitation, we went ahead with the purchase. At first, everything seemed perfect. The house had a vintage charm, but there were peculiarities we attributed to its age. The silence was deep, almost oppressive, and sometimes the air felt cooler than expected. I brushed off the odd feeling, but I always felt a subtle unease when I went down to the basement. It was a large, dim space, with stone walls that seemed to retain a damp chill and a faint metallic smell. A small window allowed a sliver of light in, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if untouched for years. It seemed like the ideal place to store things we didn't use often. In those first few days, we focused on setting up the house, unpacking boxes, and decorating every corner. In the basement, we stored items we wouldn't need immediately: toolboxes, antique furniture Samantha had inherited, and decorative pieces. But soon, strange things began happening. One day, when I went down to the basement, I noticed something that made my heart race. There were footprints in the dust, footprints that started in the middle of the basement and led to the far wall. I paused, trying to make sense of it. Samantha rarely came down here, and I was certain we hadn't left marks the last time we'd been there. The prints were too clear to be old. Trying to dismiss the strange feeling, I swept the floor clean, convincing myself that my mind was just playing tricks. For a few days, I tried not to think about it. But one night, while I was reading in bed, I heard a noise coming from the basement. It was a soft sound, like something being dragged across the concrete floor. Anxious, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the creaking stairs. When I shone the light on the floor, to my horror, the footprints were back, clearer than before, leading directly to the wall where an old shelf stood. What made it even more unsettling was the size of the footprints. They were small, like a child's. It was clear now that something wasn't right. I felt an inexplicable urge to investigate further. The next day, without telling Samantha, I called a friend who was a contractor. Together, we moved the shelf and examined the wall. Some of the bricks looked different, as though they'd been placed later. We began removing them and soon uncovered a narrow, windowless room, almost like a makeshift cell. In the center of the room, dusty, untouched furniture lay in eerie silence, a small bed and a rocking chair positioned disturbingly close. On the wall hung a black and white portrait of a child, her expression solemn, clutching a doll. Her eyes conveyed a profound sadness, almost like a silent plea. On the floor, there were old journals, their pages yellowed and fragile. A single phrase repeated across several entries. "They never let me out." It was as if the pain and despair of this child had been imprinted in every word, a haunting echo of loneliness. As I read, I felt the weight of a story that was buried, confined in that dark space for far too long. After this discovery, the house's atmosphere changed. The noises in the basement became frequent. The footprints reappeared, each time closer to the stairs, as though something were attempting to come up. The lights flickered, and I constantly felt a presence nearby, like someone was watching us. One night, as I lay trying to sleep, I heard the muffled sound of a child crying from the basement. It was a heart-wrenching, sorrowful sound. That was the breaking point. Samantha and I were exhausted, both physically and emotionally. What had once seemed like the perfect house had become increasingly terrifying. A few days later, I contacted a paranormal investigation team. They spent hours, particularly in the basement, and confirmed what I feared. There was indeed a presence down there. They explained that a restless energy was trapped in that space, and that the child's tragic story lingered in the walls, a memory that would not fade. They believed the spirit was trying to communicate its despair, seeking some form of release. We couldn't bear to live there any longer. The dream home we'd found had become a nightmare. We decided to leave and move to an apartment in the city. But the memory of that discovery still haunts me to this day. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I see the child's portrait in my mind and imagine the footprints appearing out of nowhere, as if she's still there, trapped, waiting for someone to finally free her from that dark, forgotten basement. The song that never stopped. In 2016, I bought an old house in the countryside, seeking peace and quiet. It seemed the perfect retreat, simple, isolated, and wrapped in a silence the city could never offer. During the first few days, I explored every room, familiarizing myself with the place, and eventually ended up in the basement. It was a dark, damp space, where the air felt dense, as though heavy with stories waiting to be told. The basement was in surprisingly good condition for the house's age, and I decided it would be ideal for storing some family heirlooms and my old record collection. I figured my only relationship with the basement would be the occasional trip to fetch or store something. But it soon became clear that it had other plans. One particularly quiet night, I woke up suddenly without knowing why. Trying to fall back asleep, I heard faint music, a soft melody, like an old music box playing. The tune was barely audible, but distinct, coming from somewhere beneath me. Intrigued, I got up and went to the basement door. As I opened it, the music became clearer, a nostalgic tune, almost familiar, yet one I couldn't place. I descended the stairs, each step echoing in the dark. But as soon as I reached the bottom, the music stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I searched the room, finding nothing that could explain the sound. Returning to bed, the sense that something was out of place stayed with me. The following night, the music played again at the same hour. And again it ceased the moment I reached the basement. This time, I noticed the sound seemed to come from a particular wall at the far end of the room. Night after night, the melody echoed, stopping only when I descended, as if it were teasing me, testing my curiosity. I decided to examine the wall. Tapping on it, I heard a hollow sound in one section. Something was hidden inside. With a screwdriver, I pried away some boards and uncovered a narrow cavity. Inside, there was an old, dust-covered music box. As I reached for it, a chill ran down my spine. It felt as though the box had waited for decades to be discovered. The box was slightly open, but seemed broken. I tried to close it, and to my surprise, the music began to play again, louder this time, filling the basement with a melody heavy with sorrow and longing. It felt as if the music were the voice of someone who had never found peace. I tried to shut the music box tightly to silence it, but instead, the song grew louder, echoing from every corner of the basement. And then something even more disturbing happened. Blended with the music, I heard a soft whisper near my ear, "Dance with me." The air around me grew heavy, the temperature plummeting. I felt a presence beside me, unseen but undeniably there. The whisper repeated, this time with a sad, almost pleading tone, "Dance with me." Paralyzed by fear, I couldn't move, and the basement seemed darker than before. Finally, I managed to break free. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking beneath me as the music followed, accompanied by the unsettling request that echoed in my mind. Once I reached the top floor, I slammed the basement door shut and pushed a piece of furniture against it, trying to create a barrier between me and the cursed melody. That night, I didn't sleep, and the music continued each night after. Always at the same time, always from that dark place below. As the days passed, the music grew louder, and the whispers became more frequent, echoing throughout the house. The lights flickered, and I felt that the presence in the basement was growing, feeding off my fear. Each time the song played, a weight pressed on my chest, and the voice's plea to dance became more insistent, as if the spirit tied to that music box was trapped in an endless loop of suffering. Eventually, I could take no more. I decided to leave the house for good. On my last night, as I packed my things, I heard a final whisper, close enough that it felt like it came from inside my own mind. I just wanted to dance. Since then, the house has remained empty, the basement sealed shut. The music box and its haunting tunes still linger, waiting perhaps for someone who will finally accept the invitation for one last dance. If you love mysteries and the supernatural, subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Leave a like to support the work and share with friends who are into the supernatural. Your engagement keeps these secrets alive.